Welcome back to another video. Today I'm confessing that I'm a fraud. Why? Because I say that I'm a big fantasy fan, but I have to admit that one of the biggest fantasy universes out there right now is one I haven't read yet. The Cosmere. I've just read a few books, but that's what this series is all about. I want to read all of the Cosmere books separated into the different series. And today I'm starting with Mistborn Era 1. But what even is the Cosmere? We're just gonna go through a little bit of background information. Well, the Cosmere is a fictional universe created by Brandon Sanderson, and the planets in this system all are the home of a different fantasy world or series that he has written in the past. Every planet has its own magic system, and they aren't really connected on first glance, but if you pay attention to detail, there are some slight hints and connections throughout the different books. But what is my mission here? As I said, I want to read all Cosmere books. But why is that so hard? Well, this man has insane work ethics, which is why he has written 30 books only in this universe. He has written in total over 70 books, I think. But what are the books that I'm gonna read? Well, we're starting with Mistborn Era 1, the ones I've read and want to read in this video. Then there's another Mistborn Era 2 with 4 more books, or 7 books in total in the Mistborn series. Then we have the Stormlight Archive with 5 more books. The White Sand graphic novels with 3 installments, and then 6 more standalones. You can see a quick overview here of all of the books, and I'm gonna color in all of the books that I've read already, which is about 5 books, I think. And my mission is to read all of them by the end of this series. Yeah, so today I'm gonna review all 3 Mistborn Era 1 books and do a little read along of the third one because I'm kind of in the middle of it right now. But we're starting with the first book. All of the reviews are spoiler free because this is kind of a motivational video for other fantasy readers who are maybe too intimidated to get into the Cosmere or just haven't really got around to read any of the books yet. It is book number 1, Mistborn, aka The Final Empire. This book was published in 2006 and was the book that caught the attention of Robert Jordan's wife and led Brandon Sanderson to finish the Wheel of Time series. So far, this is my favorite book that I've read by Sanderson, and it is because you could technically read it as a standalone, in my opinion. And it's really, really good for people to get into fantasy reading. In this book, we follow the main character, Vin, who is an orphan and lives on the streets of Luthadel. And she's part of this thieving crew at the beginning. She's super shy, 16 years old, and had to survive on the streets alone. And she feels very small and unimportant. She's part of this world called the Final Empire, where the Lord Ruler has ruled this empire for over 1,000 years. The world looks very dark because ashes rain from the sky, and it's very hard to get food and grow vegetables and supplies. And the world is split into 2 groups. We have the nobility, which is kind of self-explanatory, and we have the Ska. And Ska are basically slaves. They can't really participate in any public activities. They're basically just supposed to work and sleep. Vin is technically one of those Ska, but she's decided to live more in the underground, so she doesn't really have a real job. She's part of these thieving crews, because the underworld is a really, really big part of the Final Empire. But now a little detour to the magic system. The magic system here is super interesting and kind of what stood out the most reading this book, because it's based on metals. So it basically says that there are a few people called mistings that can ingest a certain metal, for example, iron, and then they have a certain power that's attached to this metal or their ability. For example, pewter makes you strong, and with steel you can push objects away or yourself from these objects. So you can kind of fly a little bit, which is really, really cool, because I'm someone who gets bored really quickly during fighting scenes. But I think in this world and with this magic system, it's just super interesting. So these mistings technically are only supposed to exist in the nobility because the skill is passed down through noble blood. But there are a few Ska people who are also mistings because, you know, nobility mixes with slaves and they have offspring. But these people are normally hunted down, so you kind of have to hide it. And then there are also these super mistings called Mistborns because they can interact with all metals that exist at that point. And quite early in the book we find out, no spoiler here because it's literally kind of in the first chapter of the book, that Wynn is a Mistborn. And she gets picked up by this guy called Cosmere, who has the most famous thieving crew in the Final Empire. And he planned this one grand final heist. and it is to overthrow the final empire and kill the Lord Ruler. So this also makes it a heist book, so a little bit like Six of Crows or, you know, Ocean's 11 if you've seen that, which makes it the perfect book as a starting point in a Cosmere or Brandon Sanderson in general, I would say. I mean, the final result after I've read all of the books, but it just feels kind of completed as the main plot of the book is the heist and overthrowing the final empire. So you technically could read this book and enjoy it and just not read any other Cosmere book. So here comes the rating of Mistborn. So here's a quick explanation on how my rating system works. First, I judge by characters. Are they three-dimensional? Can I relate to them? Are they unique? Next, I was world building, which is super important for fantasy books, and the world should be immersive, unique, and fun. Next, chokehold. This basically means if I was able to put this book down. Then we have the general opinion. Sometimes I'm wrong. Sometimes I have taste, and that's why I chose to weigh in a general opinion as well. Next up is prose, aka writing style, quite self-explanatory. Is this book well written? Followed by tightness, not to be mixed up with chokehold, because tightness takes into account any parts that could have been left out. And lastly, rereadability. Would I reread this book again, or was it a one-time thing? First up, the characters. I would give 15 out of 20 points, just because there are a lot of different characters, which I love, you know, it's the Ocean's 11 aesthetic kind of, and it's just very colorful with different personalities, but at the same time, some characters don't really feel as fleshed out, and for me that was the main character, Win. She just felt a little two-dimensional, honestly. This is why I'm giving 15 out of 20 points. Next up, the world building. As I said, I think Sanderson is great at world building, so I'm gonna give 19 out of 20 points because the world feels super unique, but at the same time it's super easy to understand because he explains it so detailed and well. And I also love the magic system, which is, you know, part of the world building. Then the chokehold ability. I've got to say that there was a part in the middle where it's just a little slower, but overall it's super interesting throughout the book, and especially the ending. You have to read the last 100 pages in one go. So I'm gonna give this 16 out of 20 points. Now we're coming to the general opinion. This book has 4.49 stars on Goodreads, which is insane for the amount of ratings it has. So I'm gonna give this a 9 out of 10, which I sadly can't give to prose. It's kind of well known that Sanderson isn't the best writer in terms of his writing style. I personally am fine with it. I think it's just very neutral. It's very clean and descriptive. So I'm gonna give this a 5 out of 10, just, you know, average. The book is over 700 pages long, and I think it shouldn't be any shorter. So I give this a 9 out of 10 in terms of tightness, just because I think there aren't really a lot of parts that you could leave out and still get the same level of understanding and immersiveness of the world. And lastly, we have rereadability. I read this book for the first time in 2024, and I've reread it already this year, so I gotta give this a 10 out of 10 in terms of rereadability. So Mistborn gets 83 out of 100 points. Next up we have The Well of Ascension, book number 2 in Mistborn Era 1. First of all, I have to say I gave this 5 stars on Goodreads as well, but the story didn't really stick to my mind as well as the first book, as the pacing was a bit slower, you know. But at the same time, I think it's kind of rare to have a book that is set after, you know, the overthrowing of this big entity. What is the Well of Ascension about? Well, in the first book we've seen how our theming crew overthrows the final empire, and here we follow them on building this new empire that is not suppressing Scar, and they kind of want to have a democracy basically. But just as the crew rebuilds the city, different armies attack and they start a siege. One of these armies is actually Elend's father, and Elend is right now kind of the king for the time being, and it's just very interesting to follow his story and character development. In this book we also learn a lot more about the lore and history and also different tribes and people inside the final empire, and we get to see a little bit of traveling. So the world building and characters didn't really change, so it's still at 15 and 19 points, but I gotta decrease the chokehold from a 16 to a 15 just because this book is a bit slower and it's still very enjoyable, but your fingers aren't trembling for picking this book up again to finish reading. So yeah, that's why I'm gonna give 15 points. We also see a slight drop in the general opinion with a 4.38 Goodreads rating. So this basically translates to 8 out of 10 points. And we're continuing with the prose. Writing style also stays the same at 5 out of 10. Tightness, I would probably give an 8 out of 10, just because there are some parts that could be a little bit more compact, but overall it was still very interesting and just super lore dense. And I also, now that I've started the third book, a lot of the information that we get in the second book help you understand the third book better. And lastly, we have rereadability. I have to drop my rating here quite a bit because I didn't really want to pick it up again, even though I've already reread Mistborn, and I just wanted to continue with the series. That's why I'm reading the third book right now. And you also get a little bit of a read along and my opinion throughout the book. So I probably would give this a 5 out of 10 in terms of rereadability. So book number 2 gets 76 out of 100 points. But this trilogy has one final installment, The Hero of Ages. And I gotta say that it was kind of slow in the beginning, but I'm at page 316 right now, and I love it so far. It totally picked up its pace, and there are a few characters that I actually enjoy reading about more now than in the first 2 books, and one of them is Spook. I don't know why, but it's one of my favorite POVs ever, because he's just funny, relatable, and I'm kind of sad that we didn't really get to see a lot of him in the first and second book, but it's very enjoyable right now. So, as I said, without any spoilers, the third book basically is about keeping the final empire together and fighting off this evil force and just keeping balance, you know? I personally have this very weird tick where I don't like final installments because they're just too epic for me, and I'm really into the first and second books of series just because they're more chill and focused on world building and character development, and I was kind of afraid to read this book. That's why I've waited for 2 years after finishing the second one. But to be honest, so far I really enjoy it. But yeah, we will see how it goes. Instead of just sitting on my couch all day and read, I decided to use the beautiful weather and read outside for a little bit. Alright, I'm finally done with this book, and to be honest, I'm surprised. I'm completely surprised. I finished the last 200 pages in one sitting right now. I read for 4 hours straight just because I couldn't put the book down. And I've got to say that The Hero of Ages definitely was better than The Well of Ascension in my opinion. So without further ado, let's just get into reviewing this book because I'm so excited to talk about it. I'm still so amped up from reading the ending, like... That was something I didn't predict, okay? So we're starting with the characters. Honestly, I gotta say that I like the depiction of these characters and what they went through better than the first 2 books because it felt more character focused. So I would give this 18 out of 20 points, honestly. Especially Spook. I loved his character growth throughout the third book, or honestly throughout the books in general. Starting with the first book where he's just super shy and kind of unimportant, but then playing a bigger role in the third book. As I said, no spoilers here. I'm honestly blown away by the fact that this book managed to change an opinion about a character that I formed 2 years ago when I read the first novel. But it's just so interesting how, while reading this book, a lot of actions that this character made in the first book made so much more sense, and you can kind of feel why they did what they did. I am sad, however, that some of the characters like Breeze and Ham didn't get as much attention as I would have hoped because they were super entertaining in the first book. But I get why it had to be done because this book is quite dense and there isn't really a lot of space for other characters to shine, honestly, because there's so much going on story-wise. World building gets the full points, 20 out of 20, just because it managed to tie up so many loose ends, or not even loose ends, things I thought was just fact, part of that world, and now I found out that it's actually just a piece of a puzzle that was presented to us in the first book, but we didn't even notice. The fact that the first 2 books did so much groundwork for what was about to come, but it didn't really feel like it. Like, some books just feel like filler, and a lot of the facts you can kind of guess that they will be important at some point. But honestly, I was so surprised by some small details that were just part of the world building or part of characters or part of culture, and I didn't even think that they would play any role furthermore or just any part in this elaborate plot that was happening in the last book. This book was insane, so 20 out of 20 world building wise. Next up we have the chokehold, and as you can kind of guess from what I've been telling you already, the book had me in a chokehold, especially at the ending. There are some parts of the siege, for example, that were kind of slow for me and felt unnecessary at the time, or maybe a bit too elaborate. But they all made sense in the beginning, and I can understand why they had to be told that way and at that pace. So I can kind of say that the chokehold was much bigger on this book than on the second book. Probably the same level or a little bit more as the first book, so I gotta give this 18 out of 20 points. The Hero of Ages also has a stellar rating of 4.56 stars on Goodreads with over 500,000 reviews, which is insane, honestly. So I just gotta agree with the public opinion and give it a 10 out of 10. Next up we have the prose, aka writing style, and I gotta say that I gave 5 points to the first 2 books because, as I said, I think Brandon Sanderson's writing is kind of average, not bad but also not great. I do feel that in Hero of Ages he just goes into a little bit more detail and his writing style becomes a bit more complex than usual. So I would give this a 6 out of 10. It still is very simplistic and doesn't really read like poetry or something super eccentric, but it works very well for what he's doing. As I already said in Chokehold, there are a few parts in this book that are a little bit slower and kind of made you question where the journey is going. But in hindsight, I gotta say that this book was extremely tight, like 10 out of 10 tight, just because there aren't really any parts that could have been left out, because everything is important and will play a part in the final pages. Even stuff that happened in book 1 or 2 that seemed like unimportant or just a random detail will have some importance in the end. That's why I think that Sanderson is superb at foretelling, foreshadowing, building on information or even characters that he mentioned at some part in the series and it's just bringing back now, but it just makes sense and doesn't really feel forced or even planted as a reader. And lastly, we have rereadability. So I will 100% read this book again. I think that The Hero of Ages also prompted me to reread the second book. I'm pretty sure that I'm gonna reread the whole series at some point, maybe at the end of the year or next year, especially because I feel like I will understand so much more and will just notice so much more details in the first 2 books that I would never know of paying attention to if I haven't read this one. Especially because there are so many details and information I probably missed or didn't really pay attention to in the first 2 books because I didn't really know that I should. And I feel like after reading The Hero of Ages, the other 2 books are even more immersive and detail-oriented. And I'm so looking forward to going on this detail hunt, honestly. So at last, what can I say about Mistborn Era 1? Overall, I would probably give the series a 9 out of 10. Mistborn was the first book ever I read by Brandon Sanderson. I've only read 5, or now it's 6 so far. But I gotta say that the trilogy was so unique, immersive, detail-oriented, and easy to follow as well. I honestly think it's a very good series to start fantasy reading or get into Sanderson or the Cosmere or whatever, but they are also just good books. So yeah, I'm super excited what this journey will bring. And I will continue with Mistborn Era 2 in the next video, so I will read all 4 books for the very first time. I have never read any of the books and do kind of a read along and also review video of that. Thank you guys for watching, have a nice day.